Welcome back to Seed School, or welcome for the first time. We are going to talk about nightshades today. We're going to focus primarily on peppers, tomatoes, and eggplant, but I'm happy at the end to answer questions about other nightshades that people may have. Husk cherries, tomatillos, potatoes or not, and so forth. So, capsicum species, peppers of many species, some of which we will dive into more than others. They are actually a perennial, for those of us in the north who might not know. They're a frost-sensitive perennial, so we treat them as an annual in the Northeast. If you dig them up at the end of the year and bring them inside in the sunny window, your pepper plants will likely live on if they're not infested with aphids by the time that you bring them in. The seed type is a dry seed. As we'll get into in a little bit, it can be either wet or dry processed, depending on the pepper, depending on the scale, and the flower type is perfect and self-compatible for the most part. There's one little exception to that rule that we'll just briefly touch upon in the next slide. But otherwise, the flowers are a perfect structure, and you can save seed from one plant. They're primarily self-pollinating with most of the species that we're going to talk about, but again, there's one exceptional species that tends almost entirely towards cross-pollination and is often self-incompatible. So, when it comes to isolation, this is on the really high end of things, and most of how we're going to approach peppers is going to be to err on the side of safety unless you have a really precise understanding or a lot of experience growing a particular pepper and you feel confident about it. So we have had sweet peppers that we have isolated by 30 feet that we've still saved seed from, and those peppers happen to be so tending towards self-pollination that we had almost no crossing. Other times we've grown them 150, 200 feet away, and we've seen rampant crossing. And the most important thing to keep in mind if you are isolating is that capsaicin, the spiciness in peppers, is a dominant gene, and it will almost always cross into your sweet peppers. So instead of getting, in most cases, if you're just letting the bees and the fellow pollinators do their thing, a milder hot pepper, you will get a hotter sweet pepper. Word to the wise. So that's why we also have, with population size, a little bit of a threshold here. So with most of what we're going to talk about below, the C. annuum complex, that would be one plant will almost always give you viable seed. C. pubescens, as we'll get to in a second, you want the higher end of seed. 25 will give you decent genetic maintenance, especially with a lot of the modern pepper cultivars, because they've been so stabilized and there's not a tremendous amount in a lot of the more modern cultivars of genetic diversity. 25 plus, the more the merrier always, but 25 plus is sufficient. With some other ones that have more variation in them, you want to go at least 50 plus for long-term diversity. Something we haven't really talked about yet, but is a solution that I'll bring up much more in the brassica and more of the outcrossers, is something known as back crossing. This is something that is a formal breeding process. It's also a referential for saving seed from a smaller population, and then in future years taking some of your older seed and planting it side by side with the newer seed. So you're re-imbuing older genetics every time that you're planting, and that's a way, if you have smaller populations, to maintain a lot of genetic diversity. So that would mean, let's say you save seed in 2020, and then you've only saved a couple plants since then. Well, you can take your 2024 seed, grow it side by side with some 2020 seed, and that should, in most cases, re-imbue enough genetic diversity that you can keep saving from a smaller population. So, third little dot there. There are three species that we generally treat as cross-compatible. C. annuum, which is most of the sweet peppers that we grow, and then C. fructescens and C. chinensis. I'm not pronouncing that right.
Say chinen.
Chinense, that's good. I don't speak Latin. We refer to these as a C. annuum complex because even though the latter two are not botanically classified as C. annuum, capsicum annuum, they are generally cross-compatible. So we treat them, as a rule of thumb, like they'll all cross with one another. So just because these are not the same species doesn't mean they can't cross. We were talking a little bit before the class about how in high school botany we were all taught that if something's a different species, it doesn't cross with other species. Well, the plant world knows so many exceptions to this rule. They do not heed Latin. They do not heed our definition of species. So this is one great example that even though you may look on your seed packet and say, I'm growing 5 different species of peppers, well, 3 to 4 of those may be cross-compatible. So just something to consider when you're designing it. A lot of these are either older forms or wilder forms of hot peppers. So they're kind of like the deep cuts. Most of what you might grow for sweet peppers would just be Capsicum annuum. So just know your genus and species when you're picking out what you're going to grow. The fourth of the 5 species of capsicum is C. bacatum, and this one is sort of a hit or miss. In some cases, if you grow it side by side with any of the complex above, you'll have no crossing at all, mostly because they're not compatible, sometimes because they are more focused on doing their own thing and pollen wouldn't spread as far as it might with other peppers. So unless you know that pepper well, treat it generally like it's going to cross with other things. And then the 5th member of the capsicum species we're talking about is C. pubescens. And that one generally, but not always, tends much more towards self-incompatibility. So if you are going to save seeds from a variety of that species, you want to make sure you have at least 5 plants just to get viable seed. And you definitely want to trend on the higher side when it comes to varietal maintenance. This one, most often, but not always, is also not compatible with any of the other capsicum species that we're talking about. It trends very strongly towards crossing within its own species. So just a little quick one, almost not worth making a slide over, but just to be consistent with previous weeks. You know how to harvest a pepper because it's fully ripe. It changes color. And just a word to those who are newer to seed saving and newer to peppers in general. Some peppers start out as a different color than green. They start out as a shiny yellow or something like that. Some peppers change into 3 different colors. They may go from green to orange to red. So you want to be really sure that you know what a fully ripe pepper of whatever variety you're working with looks like before you can safely assume that. That being said, if you take things into, as we'll see with tomatoes too, into the house that are, or into the farm or wherever you're processing, that are half ripe, they can often be left in a sunny area to continue to ripe, and that will encourage, in a warm and sunny area, some ripening off the vine. So again, like emergency scenario, predation is happening, frost is coming, terrible weather, things are rotting. Grab what you can and bring it in. It's always worth a shot. So there are a few ways to approach processing. The easiest way, and the way that we employ most frequently, is just cut them open and scrape out the seeds, and you're done. It's by far the most simple and streamlined way to clean peppers. Sometimes, depending on the particular pepper variety or the species, you may have a little bit of the flesh clinging to the seeds that is more cumbersome to pick off than you might like otherwise. In that case, you can give it a good rinse with a colander, and that stuff will separate, and then you can quickly put it on a plate or somewhere to dry. We recommend never using paper towels or coffee filters and stuff because they tend to stick to paper in the drying process. So something like ceramic or a metal sheet pan, something like that works great. So that's the easiest way to do it. So for larger batches or smaller fruits, or if you want to handle something like an extremely hot pepper as minimally as possible and you don't want to be hand cutting all those open, you can wet process them. And that would be to put them in a blender or in a food processor with a dough hook with a duller blade than the really sharp piercing blades to minimize seed damage. And then you're adding a little bit water there and you're just buzzing the whole thing up and decanting. And we're going to see this with tomatoes too, but just so everybody's on the same page, decanting is this fabulous process that you've taken all this pulp of seed and skin and flesh and it's all been ground up, and you are adding water to whatever vessel it is that you have this pulpy mixture in. The viable seeds, after 30 seconds to a minute, will sink down to the bottom of your vessel, and you start pouring off very gently, and you're decanting, and you're watching pulp fall off, you're watching pieces of flesh and other things fall off. You may even be watching light, non-viable seed slough off, but you can see almost a dividing line with the viable seed at the bottom that you want to pour just until you get about to the end of. Then you let it sit, you add some more water, let the viable seed fall to the bottom again. You continue this process until all you have left in your vessel is water and viable seed. You can pour that out through a strainer or a colander, give it a good rinse, and put it on a plate to dry, and you're done. So this works really well for smaller fruits that are really cumbersome to clean, for really hot stuff, and larger batches if you're growing, let's say, a commercial seed contract, and you don't want to be scooping every single one because this particular pepper you're growing doesn't have a structure that lends itself to easy seed cleaning. The third method, with any thin-walled peppers, you can allow the peppers to dry out. And the seeds inside are perfectly viable. And then if you're using them culinarily, you can just separate the seeds out. Ristras are one of the most famous examples of this being done. Thin-walled chiles that are strung and hung. The seeds stay viable inside as long as they're out of the sun and there's not temperature fluctuations. And that's a nice way to just dry things, especially if you're growing a paprika pepper or a chili that you're using for a dried application. Then we give it the old snap test. Take a little seed. If you can break it in half and it snaps easily and doesn't bend, it's ready to be dried. It's ready to be stored. Peppers are really straightforward, and they're a great one because you're harvesting them when you would eat them, unless you like green peppers a lot, and then you're just saving the seeds, kind of like a squash, which we'll get to another time. Really easy one to save seeds as long as you're clear on, if you're growing more than one type of pepper, where they are and how they might or might not cross. So now we're going to spend some time on tomatoes. Solanum lycopersicum. Tomatoes' Latin names have fluctuated over the years. This is the most agreed upon definition, or agreed upon term, but we're talking about all cultivated tomatoes as well as Solanum pimpifolium, which is a different species than what we're talking about now, but is cross-compatible. So all the same rules apply for all tomatoes. Tomatoes, just like peppers, are also a tropical perennial that's grown as an annual in the Northeast. The seed type is a wet seed, so this is a wonderful example of not just the decanting process that we'll repeat, but a fermentation process that we'll get into in a sec. Flower type is perfect, and they are self-compatible. There's a lot of debate as to how compatible or how crossing tomatoes might or might not be. You can get more into this if you take the botany course with us later in the month, but suffice to say right now that if you look at a tomato flower and you want to know how much this tomato might or might not cross with its neighbors, you can see where the stigma is. So tomato flower structure, I didn't put a picture in here, but they generally have what's called a fused anther cone. So the cone of the anthers basically envelops the stigma, style, and ovary, and is often pollinating itself before any insects have the chance to break in there, except bumblebees because they're just amazing. But those you can look at by just the flower structure alone and pretty reliably say, I can grow these 10 feet away from something else and they're going to grow true to type because most insects don't have a chance. If you see a flower structure that has a little thing sticking out in the middle there, that's the stigma. That's what's known as an exserted stigma. That will be much more susceptible to cross-pollination because the insects and the bees have a chance to reach that before the pollen necessarily comes in. So if a bumblebee is buzzing around your tomato patch and everything's 10, 15 feet away and it's still carrying pollen, she's carrying pollen on the back of her, and she gets into this, she might drop some pollen right on that stigma before she even touches the pollen of that flower. So that's an easy way to just look at the flower structure and say, this is more prone to outcrossing, this is more prone to self-pollinating. And that will determine what distance you want to isolate by, if you want to isolate at all. Hence the large variation, again, in isolation distance. If you're growing tomatoes on a commercial seed contract, they will recommend a 200-foot isolation distance. Generally, that is, there are always exceptions to the rule, but generally that is accepted as the standard commercial isolation distance. For those of us who are growing a lot of different tomatoes, especially if you have a small garden, the idea of 200-foot spacing for a couple different varieties may sound maddening. So try it out. Look at the flowers, and if you're doing this for the first time and you're experimenting, the worst thing that's going to happen is that you have a cross and you have a new variety of tomato to play with. And how fun is that? Maybe fun. Some of us think it's fun. What you see in this picture here is another opportunity that we will not get too deeply into, but this is what's known as a blossom bag. It's also called an organza bag. For those who are in the wedding industry, I think this is like an easy Amazon thing. These are just very, very fine mesh bags that when tomatoes are flowering, you can pop right over and let the tomatoes open up, and the only opportunity they have, for the most part, is to receive their own pollen. So it's an almost surefire way of ensuring things are true to type. So if you love growing 30 varieties of tomatoes and you really want to keep those isolated from one another, here's a pretty fail-safe way to do that. You tie a bag over. Make sure, which you don't see in this picture, there's also some brightly colored ribbon on the bottom. Because if you're moving fast and you take that bag off, you're never going to find out which one that was. No amount of photographic memory will ever lead you back to it. The picture you see here that's bagged is flowers that are already open, wide open, and have already pollinated themselves. So you do not want to wait till this stage to bag things. You want to look when the sepals are still encased over the petals, but there's like a little blush of yellow just starting to form. You want to get there before the flowers open. And then you want to wait till the flowers fall off and you're seeing a little green fruit in there that's confirming that something took in most cases. And then very carefully just removing this bag, making sure there's a marker of some sort on there, and then you're usually in the clear. So that's a great way to do it. My only suggestion there is that you, during the flowering season, bag as often as possible, because just because something is self-fertile and self-compatible doesn't mean that it's always making fruit. There are lots of flowers that may flower and drop off, and you'll never know whether or not. So don't just do it as a one and done. This is just a fun slide to show you, as my great mentor once said in his booming voice, that selection works. On the left, you see a row of tomatoes that are completely overgrown with weeds, no judgment. That is not only heirloom tomatoes, which we expect to rot at some point. There are some hybrid Czech varieties in there that we use in our tomato research. And then you can't see it in picture 1 on the left, but in picture 2 on the right, you can see the row next to it. These are side by side in an incredibly stressful year. The ones on the right are ones that we've been working with, which means we can select for disease resistance in the Northeast. And in many ways, we have a botanical obligation to do so, because we are the canaries in the coal mine as to what's going to follow with the rest of the country. We have a compendium of diseases here, including septoria, early blight, and late blight, that other areas of the country are just starting to or will experience, which in about a decade or so, according to experts smarter than me, may well render most heirlooms ungrowable in these areas. It's a crapshoot, as many of us know who grow different heirlooms every single year, unless you have a very small garden and you're not harboring tomato diseases, which many of us growing commercially are. Almost all of us are. But there's hope, and this is what I want to show you, is that getting germplasm that's diverse enough that you can select that magic unicorn out of your tomato patch and say, wow, this is that one green plant that's still putting out new growth in October while everything else is melted. That's the one you want to pay attention to. And if you'd like to participate in tomato variety trial with Freed Seed Federation, please feel free to drop us a line in the chat. So pretty straightforward, just like with peppers. Tomatoes should be fully ripe. They should change color from green. Green tomatoes, those of you who grow them know they can be a little more challenging, but basically what you're looking for with a true green tomato, meaning a tomato that ripens green, not an unripe green tomato, is that they blush on the blossom end, often pink or yellow or something like that. And the more that you have there, the better. So unlike when you might harvest for your own eating or for market sales, tomatoes can get overripe on the vine. They can get to the point where they're a little almost kind of slushy, as long as they're not diseased, where opportunities for disease, pathogens to come in, cracks and so forth, would be present there. So that's not too late. In fact, the riper the better. Again, like peppers, if tomatoes are green with a slight blush at the end of the season, you didn't get that seed-saving opportunity before the frost, you want to go for it, you can bring them in and put them in a sunny window, and in a lot of cases, you'll get it to continue to ripen off the vine and get some viable seed, maybe not all. Another thing that we've done with mixed degrees of success is the good old ethylene trick. So many of us know with the tomatoes that taste like cardboard at the grocery store, they're picked green and they're blasted in a room with ethylene so that they can be shipped 3,000 or more miles or less and look like a ripe tomato, but taste like cardboard. And that is because of the ethylene gas that we now know continues to expedite ripening and with things like onions and so forth, apples. So we've actually had cherry tomatoes that were almost completely green at the end of the season, and we stuck those puppies in a bag with a slice of apple and let them go for about a week and a half. And we got some viable seed off of them, where we otherwise would have looked at that and said, not even a sunny window is going to save this. So get creative. There are all sorts of ways where if the window's passed, you can still try to get viable seed. And this is especially important because, as we all know, who have grown tomatoes before, the further the season progresses, the more we're seeing the things that we want to see. You know, you're tasting, something tastes good, hopefully, as long as it's not too wet out, it's tasting good right out of the gates, right? But at the end of the season is when you're going to see the most important attributes of a viable tomato, disease resistance, coming to the fore. So if everything else is melted in October and that one unicorn is there standing saying, please harvest me, and there's only green fruit and frost is happening tomorrow, grab the green fruit and get creative. Processing of tomatoes. There are varying schools of thought as to how much this actually happens or not, but conventional wisdom will say that the fermentation process not only increases germination, it also kills between 75 and 95% of seed-borne diseases. The magic of microbes. And so how do we ferment tomatoes? You scoop them or you squeeze them into a jar. The end. They ferment on their own. There's so much activity, some microbial activity already present in that tomato that it's going to do the work for you. So what we usually do is we get a glass mason jar or something bigger like a bucket if you're doing a large production of this. And we're either scooping the seeds out with the pulp, or we're squeezing them, or if you're doing a large production run of tomatoes, you can just crush those things right in the bucket, skins and all, and it'll all sort itself out in the wash. And then we cover it with an old cloth or a rag or something like that, basically to prevent fruit flies from populating our fermented mess. Put a little elastic around it, so now you have your vessel, you have something covering it to keep dust and insects out. And you let that sit, and depending on how hot it is and how active the tomato is when you bring it inside, it can be from anywhere from 1 to 3 days usually. Sometimes it can be as far as 5 days, but what you're looking for is this greenish white moldy mass, like a SCOBY that develops on the top of the tomato slurry. And that's telling you that fermentation has been successful. And what we do there is we scoop that off very lightly. If you get some of the mold that mixes back into your mix, it does not matter at all. It will not affect the tomatoes. And then we're taking the tomato seed out and we're feeling it. For those of us who have eaten tomatoes, which is, I think, everybody who's attending this tonight, the seeds inside a tomato have this little gelatinous casing around them. And that is the wet-seeded brilliance of nature insulating itself from germinating prematurely inside a wet fruit. What you're doing with that fermentation process, aside from killing many, if not most, seed-borne diseases, is that you're breaking that gelatinous sac down. And when you feel the tomato seed after you take it out, it will feel kind of rough and fuzzy. It will not feel slippery and squishy anymore. And you'll know that that tomato seed is good to go. And then we begin the decanting process again. So then I should have said this before, but we're always using a vessel where we have room to grow, so that when the fermentation process is complete, you're adding water and mixing it around if necessary, just to shake everything up, because sometimes, especially if you're just squishing whole tomatoes in, you may have pieces of pulp that are stuck to the seeds that, even though they're still there, will break down easily after the fermentation process. And then you're letting the viable seeds float down 30 seconds to a minute or so, pouring the slurry out till you get just about to the seeds and then stop. And again, some light seeds may just make their way out. That's okay. If there are seeds that are floating around in that slurry, they are almost certainly non-viable seeds, including seeds that may be stuck to pulp. If they're stuck to pulp, that means they weren't mature enough to drop off on their own. So don't worry about the seeds that fall off in the top. Just focus on that critical mass on the bottom, that pile of seeds, and just pour right up to that spot and then stop. Add more water, let it settle, pour it off, so on and so forth, until you have clean tomato seed. And this one, even more so than peppers, is important to give a good rinse afterwards because they stink. So pour that slurry off, and then when you have just viable seed and water, pour it into a colander or a strainer, give it a good healthy rinse on some non-stick surface to dry, and you're good. Snap test again, take that little seed, give it a bend. If it bends, it's not ready. If it snaps, it's ready. There is a dirty little secret, especially prevalent in tomatoes based on our experience, which is what we've sometimes called high nose, which are hybrids in name only, meaning there's a good chance that either the parentage that created that hybrid are super similar, or it's not actually a hybrid. And some sneaky decided that they would consider it a hybrid for commercial purposes, so curious folks like ourselves wouldn't save seed from them. So if you either want to just test that theory because you love sun gold tomatoes, or whatever hybrid it might be, or you're curious to start a new breeding project, and you can deal with the kaleidoscope that comes in the next generation after you save seeds, go for a hybrid. But otherwise, always go for open pollinated. All heirlooms are open pollinated. Again, not all open pollinated varieties are heirlooms, because heirloom is a cultural definition, something that's been within a family or community for 50 years or more. So any heirlooms, good to go. Anything that doesn't say F1 next to it, good to go. You'll know you're clear for that. And again, tomatoes are another one. Every seed is precious, and every attempt at seed saving is super important because we're all collectively participating in the future of food here and giving the generations for which we are borrowing from already more opportunities for diversity of choice and diversity of things that will grow well. Tomatoes just need so much work. I've gone on political tangents historically about these, but as a commercial grower, the trend goes increasingly towards protected culture and increasingly towards hybridized tomatoes, which means the tomatoes are bred in and for greenhouse culture and not for field culture more and more and more, because harder time growing tomatoes, more erratic weather, novel arrivals of pests and disease, which means more and more risky to grow a field tomato, especially in southeastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island, where we have, often drought and humidity coupled with one another for extended periods of time. That means that the selections of what tomatoes are available increasingly are favoring that kind of commercialized, industrial, largely process, not favoring growing a good field tomato outside with, good old sunshine and rain and all those things. So there's an especially important need to breed good open pollinated tomatoes. And especially with the commercial growers among us, there is a stigma many of us inherited that hybrids, especially hybrid tomatoes, are just inherently better. There are some catalogs that I'm not going to mention here that say things like, we're carrying this one cherry tomato because try as we might, we just couldn't find a hybrid to beat it. The assumption being that hybrids will always be better. Let me tell you something, they will not. And I have plenty of slides that we could have included that didn't, where our open pollinated strains that others have developed and shared with us that we're continuing on are as good or better than the most competitive and most frequently grown hybrids. The proof is in the pudding. So, and more flavorful, yes, that's also important to reiterate here. Most tomatoes, modern varieties, are bred for disease resistance, productivity, and appearance. They are not, in most cases, until recent efforts, bred for flavor. So there's a whole trend now in certain catalogs especially that if you want to grow what looks like an heirloom tomato, you're growing what's actually called a highloom tomato, which is a hybridized version of what heirlooms used to be. It looks like a Cherokee purple. It looks like a German green. It looks like a whatever. Flavor often is an afterthought or a happy accident of that process. It is not a prerequisite. The reason heirloom tomatoes were saved in communities was because, first and foremost, they were almost always culturally meaningful to that particular cuisine, but second, because they tasted really good and they were worth saving. And a lot of those heirlooms were passed down within one family from one particular hyper-adapted region. And there's no reason that they can't be imbued with fresh genetics where you can create something new because you know how to grow tomatoes really well, and you can either let them freely cross or, as we'll offer later on, get more into hand pollination techniques, and you can bring that flavor of the old into the new. Don't be fooled that hybrids are always inherently better. They're not. It's a vicious cycle that the funding goes there because there's de facto proprietary ownership of hybrids, and because more and more people rely upon hybrids, therefore the money goes towards the hybrids. It's a vicious cycle that we can all collectively break and have tomatoes that we can save reliably for generations. We've generally eschewed giving viability lengths of how long seeds can store for because most of the projected storage life for seeds we've seen upended in the most dramatic examples, and I'll share an example of that in a second. But the best way to store anything is in a situation where you know it's not going to have any possibility of temperature fluctuations or moisture coming in. So if your tomato seed in this case is reliably dry, you give it a little teeny snap test and it breaks for you, you can put them in a glass jar or some kind of airtight plastic vessel knowing that it's dry enough. We tend to use glass when we're sure that things are sufficiently dry because mice can't get in them. And we've had, squirrels chew through a farmhouse wall and 2 layers of plastic looking for corn. So that's sort of a surefire way if it's stored somewhere that especially with those of us who live in old houses, rodent predation is possible. Otherwise, just keeping them in an envelope or in a paper, paper mailing envelope, something like that, brown bag even, if that's it, that's perfectly fine as long as they're not in an area where they're vulnerable to moisture and temperature fluctuation. The seed garden, which we use as a reference point often. The book, The Seed Garden, also Seed to Seed. They have, and then online as well, Seed Savers Exchange has this, I know, and others. There are guides on how long seeds can generally keep for. Almost all seeds can go into the freezer if you need them to keep for a long time, and you're automatically going to extend their life tenfold. I mean, this is the principle behind a lot of the storage facilities like the Doomsday Vault of Svalbard and others. They're put in cryogenic storage conditions so they can store sometimes for 100 years. But those general parameters on the viability of the seed, we have seen phenomenal exceptions to, which have made us reluctant to give recommendations on that. It's all in how you store it, if you store it well. Two examples really quick. One is that onions and leeks in the allium family that we will touch upon in a couple weeks, those are sort of notorious for having like a 1 to 2 year life cycle before the germination drops radically. We have had people give us onion seed that's been 11 years old and still had 70% germination. It was likely that was kept in a freezer for part of its life, but always try, basically, is my advice. The more you can save seed, the better, but if you can't save seed from something every year, taking a couple of years off is fine. Just knowing that every year that seed is sitting, it's continuing slowly but surely, because it's alive and dormant, to use some of its energy. A quick example is there's a famous squash now that's known as Gete okosamim, which is Anishinaabe for really cool old squash, which was named by Winona LaDuke. This was a squash variety that was found in a clay vessel in an earthen pit at an ancestral site. And there were, I think, 3 seeds in the clay vessel. They were carbon dated to be over 700 years old. And guess what? One of them germinated. There's some old knowledge that we would do well to pay attention to and rediscover if we don't know it already. But that upends any squash referentials about how long a squash seed might keep. So it's all in how you store it. I just think that's an amazing story, and hopefully more of us will do our homework and dig earthen caches to be able to store our seeds successfully, because if you got them in a temperature-controlled box, power goes out, things fluctuate, all that stuff. Not so. The earth is stable for the most part. So let's move on to eggplant with the little bit of time we have left. Solanum melongena. Another perennial, surprise, surprise, unless some of you are from the tropics originally. We grow it as an annual, and it's a hot weather lover, so we know that in the Northeast, which is important to think about. Selecting early production in the Northeast in the field is a wonderful thing to pay attention to eggplant, because cool early summers like we've been having along the coast especially means eggplant is slow, and eggplant also loves water. So think about eggplant that can thrive with dry farming practices, which is one of the screening factors that we often do when we're looking at eggplant varieties. The seed type is a wet seed, even though it doesn't have the same kind of obvious gelatinous casing that a tomato has. We still consider it a wet seed, and even though we don't ferment it, which I suppose you could, but I don't know that there's any obvious benefit to it, we process it as a wet processed seed. So we just are calling it a wet seed here because it's got moisture around it and it does its thing, and that's great. But there's no need to ferment. Perfect self-compatible flowers. Eggplants are notorious for both being strong self-pollinators and rampantly crossing with one another. So you want to give eggplant more distance than you'd give other nightshades, because the composition of an eggplant flower is such that it much more readily receives other pollen along with its own. So one thing we haven't talked about with something like a pepper or an eggplant that you can explore, and we can provide some resources later after the course, is cage isolation. So let's say you have 2 eggplants you just can't possibly decide. You love them both. Well, there are ways that you'll find online, and we can provide information for, to construct basically an isolation cage over your one variety. That would be something like fine mesh, like we saw with the organza bag, or even row cover, although that's not ideal for a number of reasons. And you're basically alternating days. So one day, one variety is open to the world, and the pollinators can freely pollinate it. The next day, you move that to the other side, and the other one's freely exposed. This is a very effective way that's employed by a lot of seed houses and heirloom seed collections of maintaining multiple varieties simultaneously. It's basically just alternating who has access to pollinators on what day. That's a perfectly great way of doing things that we'll provide more information from at a later time. But generally speaking, keep them far apart as much as you can. One plant does it for viable seed in almost all cases, but you want to keep at least 25 plants for genetic diversity. And again, as we mentioned before, and we'll mention again, team up with your neighbors. If you don't feel like you have enough space to keep a population of eggplant going long term, have some of your neighbors grow it and combine your seed and share it and sow it together. Or use seed from previous years to reinvigorate. Just keep genetics in there to avoid this bottleneck where everything's being selected to the point where the things that you want aren't there anymore, or the seed can't continue to co-evolve. So with eggplant, the mature fruit is later than what you would harvest for food. If you harvest an eggplant for food and you get a bunch of seeds in there, you're not happy about it in most cases, right? You want eggplants that don't have a lot of seed in it if you're baking them or roasting or frying them. So when the fruit stays on the plant longer, you see some color changes happening. It's most often expressing itself yellow or brown, but sometimes it'll go from a purple to a lighter pink. But you'll notice that the eggplant will become more swollen than when you're harvesting it for food. And the sheen around an eggplant will start to dull as well in almost all cases. So the eggplant will look markedly different than when you're harvesting it for food. Depending on the variety, experiment and know some varieties, it's not that they get bigger per se, they stay the same thing and they just slightly blush color. And when you cut into that eggplant, you will know that the seed is viable because the seeds are bigger, they're not little white and squishy, and they're darker colored, usually kind of like an orangish yellow or sienna kind of color there. Again, if you harvest the eggplant off the plant, if it's enough into its botanical maturity, it started to change color, it started to go duller. Sunny window, you can push it a little further, a couple days to a week even, and you'll get more viable seed in there as it will continue to mature off the vine if it's gone past that point. But don't let it rot, because then again, you're introducing seed-borne diseases. So, processing of eggplant. Somewhat similar to what we were talking about with pepper processing, if you're doing it on a larger scale. Not always, but in most eggplant, and you can cut into one and take a look, the seed is concentrated on the blossom end, which is the bottom, not the stem end where the little hat is on, but the blossom end with the little dimple on the bottom. In most varieties, that's where most of your seed is, which means when you cut into it, you don't have to bother with that first 1/3 or however much, half of the eggplant that has no seed in it. So cut one open, take a look, and that will inform how much slurry you have to deal with subsequently. Just focus on where the seed is most concentrated. So the process is basically this. Chop it into cubes, little pieces, being careful that you're not cutting too much into seeds. So just kind of loose cuts. You can also break it apart into smaller pieces. But you want to get it into enough pieces that when you put it in a blender or a food processor with some water, it buzzes up really easily. So then it goes into the blender, goes in with some water. You buzz that until it's an indiscernible pulp, and then pour that into a vessel or keep it in the blender if you so choose. But somewhere where you can add more water, and then we're decanting all over again. Pour the water in, mix the slurry around, viable seed falls to the bottom, you pour the slurry off, and so on and so forth, until you have gorgeous eggplant seed that you can give a strain and dry. So that's it with eggplant. I just wanted to do a couple lightning round notes because we've had questions in the past. Another one that people try to save seeds from a lot is tomatillos, and tomatillos are an important exception just to touch upon really quickly. Tomatillos, unlike all the nightshades that we just talked about, are not, almost never, always exceptions, almost never self-compatible. So if you want to save tomatillo seed in earnest, you want a big population, the bigger the better. You need at least 5 plants to get viable seed from it. So don't be discouraged if you saved one fruit from one tomatillo plant and that was all that you had in your garden and nothing came up. It's not your fault. Other than that, you could essentially save tomatillo seed the same way that you would save tomato seeds through the fermentation process. Ditto with husk cherries or ground cherries. Although ground cherries are very tending towards self-pollination, they're not needing a larger population like tomatillos are, but they can be fermentation processed the same way that we talked about with tomatoes. So those are a couple of notable exceptions of ones that people are often trying to save seed from the nightshade family. Potatoes. I shouldn't say don't save seed. Go for it if you want. But as many of you have noticed growing potatoes, we're growing potatoes from what? Not seeds, true seed, but what we call seed potatoes, which are clonally propagated chunks of tuber. In a lot of cases, especially with modern potatoes, if you let those grow, if you're lucky enough not to have them slayed by late blight or something like that, when they grow to full botanical maturity, they often don't even produce a little fruit after flowering. But for those that do, if you're paying attention, you will see after the potato flowers drop off, a little hard green spherical fruit. That is the true potato seed. You will not get potatoes that are true to type. You will have a breeding project. But you can successfully brag to your peers that you saved true potato seed, and lo and behold, you have a new variety. So a quick run through of that scenario, if you so choose, which if you do, like, bless you, go for it. You would save those till they are as mature as they look. They're still green, but they're a little less firm than they would be when they immediately form. Cut them open, ferment, the whole process, decant, strain, dry, plant the next year, and in about 2 to 4 years, you're going to have enough of a tuber from that plant, maybe even the first year, but usually a couple years, you're going to have a tuber that you can save from. And then you can look at this wildly diverse potato population that you've got this far with and say, I've created a new potato variety. Just make sure you taste it first. That's all I'm going to say about potatoes. Generally speaking, saving seed from potatoes is a bit of a rabbit hole. Everybody's excited to save seed from all these? I mean, all plants are wonderful, but they're particularly wonderful ones to save seed from, and particularly important given hybridization and the like. So thank you very much for being here, as always.